In terms of this video's contents, I will only be covering the first 7 seasons of Thomas for the sake of my own sanity, and will be discussing the books written by Wilbert Awdry. I also ask that you do not go and harass anybody that will be mentioned in this video. As a way to build up my arguments, I will be referencing many different authors and YouTubers who have made accusations about Thomas that I believe to be wrong. I will be mentioning their names due to their works being on public platforms, and while I disagree with their views, I do not wish any ill will upon any of them. This is a simple and fun discussion about a children's show, and I wanted to stick to just that. If you have your concerns about the authors, then the comment section is where you should go. Thank you very much for listening, and let's begin. The year was 1911, and a man who would leave his mark in the world of children's literature would be born in the small village of Ampfield, Hampshire, in England. The man's name was Wilbert Awdry, a fellow who grew a fascination with the world of railways and a passion that he would go on to share with millions around the world through his railway book series, which spawned a little blue engine that would touch the hearts of many, Thomas the Tank Engine. In the year 1984, Brett Alcroft and David Mitton would take the book series and with an approximately £500,000 budget, or £1,580,593 when judging for inflation, they would create a series that adapted a majority of the books and is still going on to this day, albeit with some changes to the original show's format. Thomas the Tank Engine's name is one that many know online, from fans who watched the series for many years to people who only know him through the various cursed memes and imagery that the engine somehow attracts. But the thing that Thomas is most well known for is the show's more questionable undertones. I'm sure that many of you have seen or heard people talk about the world of the island of Sodor and have seen them laugh in horror at the fates of some of the engines on Sodor. You do not need to look far to get hit with article after article that calls the series either imperialist, authoritative, and the most popular word of the day, dark. Through these accusations, Thomas has received quite the reputation in recent years for being a series that is supposedly far less innocent than just being a series about talking engines on a fictional island in the Irish Sea. And through these claims of tyranny and bloodshed, Thomas's name is now slowly being associated with darker meaning. As a die-hard fan of the original show and having read a good few of the books in my youth, I do not share this sentiment among the general public, and stand firmly alongside the fans who grew up with the show and saw and experienced what the darker stories truly meant and represented. This video is a means to not only debunk and counter-argue against some of the more common criticisms thrown towards the series, but to explain the success and the magic that drew so many children into the series to begin with. So, I hope that you are comfortable and you enjoy your experience as I talk about Thomas the Tank Engine and what it really represents for the next few minutes. Starting with the magic. Part 1. The Magic of Thomas. To understand why the books and series kicked off so strongly and worked so well, you would have to go back and look at the life of the author, Wilbert Awdry, and his son, Christopher Awdry, to see the origins of the little blue tank engine that the world grew to love. Growing up, Awdry was deep in the world of railways. His father, William Awdry, had a massive enthusiasm for the trains, and took his son to see the sights and wonders of steam engines and their branch lines through his connections.
My father was a keen amateur railwayman. He was vicar of Ampfield between Winchester and Rumsey. Yeah. And I remember, when I was 3 or 4, going for walks with my father through the parish. And our favourite walk was to go up down to Bedsley Bridge, climb up the embankment and walk along the track.
To quote Awdry himself, "My father had been interested in railways all his life, for he had been born in 1854 and had, as he said, grown up with them. Many of his parishioners were railwaymen, and he visited them in their platelayers' huts or on the station. Sometimes he would take me with them. The men were all aware that their vicar knew almost as much about railways as they did, and no one ever turned railway parson away." Along with his brother George, it became clear to see that it was through his father and life around the railways did Awdry's love for steam engines and railways grow stronger and stronger. In 1917, when Awdry was around 6 years old, his family had moved to Box in Wiltshire, and the house they stayed in was in sight and earshot of the Great Western Railway's main line near Middle Hill. It was here that the idea of character start to form inside Audrey's head, who claimed that the engines had a sort of humanity to them, being able to tell certain engines apart from the way that they sounded. He, quote, used to lie in bed at night, listening to the engines struggling up the hill to Box Tunnel, and imagining that they were talking to themselves. To further quote him directly, there was no doubt in my mind that steam engines all had definite personalities. I would hear them snorting up the grade, and little imagination was needed to hear the puffings and pantings of the two engines, the conversation they were having with one another. I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
Can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it. And the banker would come up behind. Oh, yes, you can. Oh, yes, you can. Oh, yes, you can.
This love for the railway would never die out, and it was as he grew older, married his wife Margaret Whale, and had his son Christopher Audrey, would history be made. At the age of 3, young Christopher was going through a bout of measles, and to entertain his son as he got better, Wilbert would tell him stories about engines inspired by the imaginations he had as a child. Christopher adored these stories, and it was through wanting more did the world of Sodor come to life. The 3 Railway Engines, the first book ever to be released in the series, were the first stories that Audrey told to his son. Thomas, the titular character of the show, was not the first engine created by Audrey, and was actually created due to circumstance. During this time, war was ravaging England. It was the height of World War II, and living conditions were far from ideal. Wilbert, like many others, was a poor man at this time in his life, and toys were very scarce. The only toys he would really give his sons were engines created with spare parts that he found laying around the house. For one Christmas, his son had wanted him to make him a model of Gordon, one of the characters from the first few stories Audrey had told him. However, Audrey didn't have the parts to do so. So instead, he made a 060 steam engine out of an old broomstick, a tube of metal, a 2-pronged metal fastener with a rounded head, and flattened out heads of drugget pins fastened with screws. The name Thomas the Tank Engine, Wilbert claimed, came naturally, even saying that the name had been, quote, christened. It was through these tales of the mythical railway engines that made his wife encourage Audrey to try and, quote, do something with the stories Audrey had created. With his connections to a publishing company, Audrey managed to make his first few stories, The 3 Railway Engines, into a book in 1945, and made a new addition to the series almost every year until the year 1972, resulting a total in 26 books, which he made alongside his son, who acted as his second-in-command. Christopher would carry on the legacy of his father when he started making up his own stories to entertain his son, Richard, who was around the same age he was when Audrey introduced him to the world of Sodor. Through the support of his father, he would release his own stories until 1996, with a bunch of his stories paying tribute to the original railways that inspired his father many years ago. Thomas and the island of Sodor were ideas formed from a place of sincerity, a desire to comfort, and pure love for the world of railways. Brian Sibley, the author of the book The Thomas the Tank Engine Man, wrote that his belief on why the stories felt so authentic was because the series, quote, began not with any idea of publication, but as a story told to please one particular child. Audrey didn't have an audience in mind when he told his first few tales, and it's through this personal connection to his son that the stories have this magic that only a loving father could produce when he's trying to entertain his child. The language contained in the books is simple, occasionally had rhymes, and every so often had a word that would encourage a child to either ask the meaning of, or something that he just added to amuse himself, which would likely help other adults feel bemused later on whenever they read his stories to their children.
Did you write it for yourself, or did you write it for you? Who'd you write it for?
Well, when you're writing a children's book, you're writing for a whole lot of people. You're writing for yourself to make sure that you've got it researched right. You're writing for the unfortunate parents who've got to read it aloud time after time after time after time. You've got to put in little funny bits, subtle bits, which they'll enjoy.
Through this 2-person-only entertainment, the bond between father and son grew, and with only himself to anchor the world of Sodor, the stories came to life filled with personality through memories and stories that Audrey took from his own life. Audrey liked accuracy and authenticity more than anything. Unlike other writers who anthropomorphized vehicles to create a character to please children, Audrey was a big advocate of, quote, drawing from life. He would take stories or events that he knew or heard about from his lifetime around engines and put those moments into his work. In one interview with Press Reader, he said, quote, the stories are all about real things that have happened to real engines, even an elephant pushing an engine out of a tunnel, and Thomas getting fish in his water tank. He was, quote, determined that his stories should remain true to authentic engine behavior. This passion to represent the world of railways so accurately was something that didn't go unnoticed by critics of the books, with reviewers pointing to the fact that Audrey's work was particularly special because, quote, like all the best and most successful writers for children, he didn't condescend to children. He wrote about a subject that he absolutely delighted in and knew a lot about, which was railways. The engines lived for him, and that came across to children. Christopher Audrey agrees with this sentiment. When reminiscing in a 2015 Guardian interview and he was asked about why he thought the books were successful, his answer was either, quote, his father was always aware of the fact that parents were as much as readers as children, or his trait of never talking down to young people. He elaborates by saying, quote, when we were little and with our friends, he would always talk to us as people. He always made us feel as children that we were worth having a conversation with. And I think that came through in the books. Thomas and the Island of Sodor were stories that Audrey told about a world that he knew inside and out, longing to share his love for his lifestyle with his family and eventually the world. He understood the childlike whimsy one gets when they get to indulge in their own special interests, and the value of bringing people into his world without coming off as condescending and stuck up, but welcoming and comfortable. Above all, Audrey had a deep love for children. He was around them for a good few years when he taught them in a Sunday school, and in wanting to refine their wild thoughts, he made sure to pay attention to the world building and representation he gave to the engines who inhabited his world, respecting and adoring the imagination of children. He respected a child's intelligence and keen eye for small details, something he had done with his artist when he drew Gordon with inconsistent buffers and drawing Thomas's station differently between books, something that, quote, sharp-eyed boys and girls would see and write to me about it. He understood the value of childhood, embracing their rebellious attitudes by saying, quote, Thomas is the eternal child. Thomas is given a prohibition, naturally as all children do when they're told not to do something, they want to know why, and they find out why by doing it. This love for railways, understanding of children, and warm storytelling was something that the show adaptation did wonders in taking from the books. Watching an episode of Thomas hits you immediately with the simplistic, yet beautiful nature of a short bedtime story. Each episode in the early seasons were roughly 4.5 minutes long, meaning that the narratives told had to be concise and to the point, because to indulge would cause the show to meander and lose the initial spark of the homely vibes the stories are supposed to give. Some of the early episodes went as far as to nearly quote the books they adapted, word for word.
Engine's name is Henry. His driver and fireman argued with him, but he would not move. The rain will spoil my lovely green paint and red stripes, he said. The guard blew his whistle till he had no more breath, and waved his flag till his arms ached. But Henry still stayed in the tunnel and blew steam at him.
Not only was time quite restrictive, but the models, music, and sets were as well. Everything from the engine's expressions only changing during camera cuts with only their eyes moving, the action figure style of the drivers and the Fat Controller, the looping melodies of the musical tracks, and the whole story being narrated and voice acted by only one guy, all gave the show that same comfort that a child gets when their parents tuck them into bed to read them a story before going to sleep, or making up a story in their head while they're playing with their toys. Even the subpar voice acting of Ringo Starr in the earlier seasons gave the episode's charm, as it gave off the vibes of a parent who didn't have a wide vocal range having to voice many characters, and due to inexperience, the voices only had slight variation. It can be seen as a charming evolution when Michael Angelis would replace Starr and give the world his voice that was more varied, more refined, and more expressive. His improved performance is almost like a father who had grown a talent from telling so many stories with the same characters, stories that he told for over 20 years. Thomas and Friends, from its simplicity, sincerity, and authenticity, is a series that provides comfort to the viewer. And it's through this comfort does the story allow itself to teach various lessons and expose children to simple messages that form them into the people they become as they get older. Messages that are far more simplistic and traditional than lessons nowadays. Part 2. Thomas and Tradition. Quote from Audrey. One of the nice things about our island is that the engines there know that they are safe and that whatever happens to steam engines, the Fat Controller will always take care of them. The island of Sodor is a special place in the world of Thomas. In the lore of the books, it is stated that overseas, steam engines are a thing of the past. Time was not kind to them as the world evolved to have more modern and efficient kinds of engines and vehicles that relied on fewer resources that the steam engines couldn't adapt to. Because of this, steam engines were abandoned by progress and scrapped off the face of the planet. In the story Tenders for Henry, Gordon talks to the Fat Controller, where this conversation ensues. I keep thinking about the dreadful state of the world, sir. Is it true, sir, what the diesels say? What do they say? They boast that they've abolished steam, sir. Yes, Gordon, it is true. What, sir? All my Doncaster brothers, drawn the same time as me? All gone, except one. In the same story, Gordon talks to the last remaining tender engine, the Flying Scotsman, and they have a small chat. You've changed a lot, smiled Flying Scotsman. I had to rebuild a crew. They didn't do a proper Doncaster job, of course, but it serves. I had a rebuild too. It looked hideous, but my owner said that I was an extra special engine, and made them give me back my proper shape. Is that why you have two tenders, being special? No. You'd hardly believe it, Gordon, but over there, they've hardly any coal and water. But surely every proper railway... Exactly. You are lucky, Gordon, to have a controller who knows how to run railways. In another story, Bluebells of England, Percy tells Douglas about how steam engines are treated overseas, saying, I couldn't understand it all. They don't like engines anymore. They put them in cold damp sidings and then... Percy nearly sobbed. They cut them up. With Douglas replying, You're right there. If I hadn't escaped, I'd been cut up too. It's all because of yon diesels. They're all devils. The march of progress had abandoned the age of steam, and this mindset about diesels taking over the jobs of steam engines, and the resentment and fear that build up in the engines in thinking of such a fate, is a worldview that is shared by the author himself. Audrey was not just a fan of railways, but a massive supporter. He and his son were railway preservationists, and did whatever they could to keep the railways they held dear alive and well. Through the books, Audrey managed to drive notice and support towards different railway lines, and it was because of his impact in the world of fiction did some of these businesses actually stay afloat for quite some time. To quote the family website documenting Audrey's life, as time went on, he built several model railway layouts, which he greatly enjoyed taking to exhibitions all over the country, often assisted by his great friend and fellow railway enthusiast, the Reverend E.R. Teddy Boston. Wilbert was involved with railway preservation from its first days in 1950, and was always grateful that he was, through his models and in other ways, able to make a useful contribution to it.
Have you got one of those?
I've got one.
Have you?
It's been on the exhibition circuit since 1963, when I first showed it at the Model Railway Club Easter exhibition at Central Hall.
You've always been
and
obsessed.
Now
haven't
I've
you?
come back
Yeah.
to open the International Model Railway exhibition at Central Hall Saturday.
Because of this love for steam engines and a nostalgia for a past that was dying out very quickly, change was something that Audrey was not a fan of, and it showed plainly in his works when he added in more and more diesel engines into the mix, most of whom shared certain traits relating to superiority and ego. In the article writing about his life written by Richard Dalby, he wrote, quote, In order to keep the series up to date, Audrey was persuaded to introduce a diesel into his next book, Duck and the Diesel Engine. His dislike for these modern innovations is reflected in the oily and malicious character of Diesel, who was the only engine in the series not to be given a name. By the time he was nearly done with the series, Dalby writes that Audrey, quote, felt alienated from the world of the modern railway and had little inspiration for new tales.
Let me ask you about the modern engines, because these children don't see steam engines very much. They see diesels and they see electric trains. But you didn't write about those, even though you were still writing the books 10 years ago. Why? What's wrong with them?
Well, they're dull. They haven't got any personality. Steam engine, whether it's working hard or whether it's standing quietly, has always got something to say. But a diesel has got nothing to say except a sort of, well, self-satisfied purr or a growl if it's not pleased at all. And electric, especially the London Underground, they're rather like worms. They live in holes, and you've got the feeling that, like a worm, you could cut it in half and it wouldn't mind. Diesel, there's another thing about diesels. They're two-faced.
Really?
Yes. You know what two-faced people are like. You never know. You can't trust them.
Audrey was a man of tradition and conservative in his views. Drastic change was something that was not welcome in his life, for why should something that wasn't broken need fixing? Because of the ever-changing world that surrounded him, Audrey's work became more and more pro-steam, and anti-diesel sentiments lay everywhere in the stories. Sodor was an island that became a land of peace and prosperity for steam engines to go to when the world seemed to turn its back on the past, undermining their impact and replacing them with engines that were riddled with ego and crass. Steam engines are prioritized and taken care of greatly on the island of Sodor. They get all the coal and water they need to be healthy, they get sheds to rest in after a long day's work, and if certain engines require additional support, the Fat Controller is more than happy to account for them, like with Henry needing Welsh coal to work properly. With this favoritism towards engines that were going out of fashion, it makes sense that diesels, engines that were the next step in progress, are looked at with caution and disdain. The world had abandoned the age of steam, so diesels coming onto the last land that preserved such a legacy would of course be seen as something to be concerned about.
We diesels don't need to learn. We know everything. We come to a yard and improve it. We are revolutionary.
Everyone knows that tenders are a mark of distinction, but I'm afraid that no amount of tenders will save you in the end. We diesels are taking over, and we don't need tenders to make us important, not even one.
It's not your fault, but your controller should scrap you and get engines like me. A fill of oil, a touch on the starter, and I'm off. No bother, no waiting. They have to fuss around you for hours before you're ready.
However, it's not all doom and gloom, for diesels and other vehicles still have a chance to prove their worth and alliance to the Steamies. Characters like Rusty, Mavis, Daisy, Terence, and Boko are a few examples of different engines learning the roots of Sodor and integrating themselves into the island's traditions to make the island better and more efficient. While different in appearance, the desire to work hard and prove themselves conquers the perceived threat of takeover given to them by the other engines, and thus are seen as useful and reliable members to Sodor. These stories also had messages of learning to accept differences, and the Steamies' inbuilt resentment of diesels is challenged and even shown to be wrong once their supposed enemies prove that they mean no harm. But the resentment for these different engines in other cases proved to be right. Other characters like Diesel, Ari, Bert, George, Bulgy, and the three lorries are characters who believe to be above integrating into Sodor and see the land as not one for opportunity to join forces, but to take over. These characters are crass, egotistical, rude, and above all, horrid. They cause disorder on the island through lies, threats, bullying, and chaos, and it's these characters that are the ones that get punished and sent off the island. Sodor is a place that is a safe haven for steam engines and others who wish to join that group. It is an island that has its practices and traditions that every engine must follow and respect so that the island can run the way it always had. Hard work, good appearance, kindness, and respect for passengers are some of the rules that all the engines must understand as virtues that make Sodor a well-perceived business and home. Diesel engines and other vehicles who come onto the island and do not follow the rules but cause confusion and delay are seen as enemies to the island and are punished as fast as possible so that their disorder can be mended and the island can return to a state of orderly peace. These characters can be a symbolism towards many different concepts, varying from something as small as misbehaving children who act like they know better, to foreign cultures and people who do not respect the countries they move to and try to uproot the values and traditions of the native land, bringing in new ways that contradict core beliefs held on the island. Though knowing Robert Audrey, I feel that these interpretations could be too heavy. After all, the man just hated diesels. Sodor runs on a basic philosophy: integrate or leave. Engines of all kinds that come and show their worth are welcomed in open arms by the fellow engines, while those that try and declare great change, brag of replacement and revolution, are punished and sent back home. Sodor is a safe haven for all engines as long as they respect the rules and traditions of the island, and understand the importance of doing one's part to keep the island running happily and smoothly. Engines come to work, and that's all they are required to do in order to live in peace on the one island that refuses to let go of the practices that kept the world chugging along for hundreds of years, valuing the conservation of a bygone era for all the good it had done. And it's this demand for tradition, order, and hard work that caused a few people online to accuse the show of much more sinister themes and messaging, and this is where the conversation gets more interesting. Part 3. The not-so-dark reality of Thomas. From wanting order, demanding that traditions be upheld, and that engines must work hard and be useful to earn their place on Sodor, these kinds of rules have made some people accuse the stories as showing signs of imperialism, that the system of Sodor is one that is oppressive and shows a large love for top-down order, with some even calling it an authoritarian nightmare. Jessica Roque in 2011 wrote an article for Slate titled Thomas the Imperialist Tank Engine, where she writes about the imperialistic subtext of the show. One of her paragraphs reads, quote, "The Thomas series glories instead in true white man's burden-style British imperialism. Our hero, Thomas, and his friends jockey for positions just below that of the bullying aristocrat Sir Topham Hatt, but never seek to rise to his level. The stern, dour little Englishman in top hat and tails dangles meaningless honours like getting to carry the most special to divide and conquer the trains." By the end of the article, Roque makes a call to action for the engines, where she says, "But when you have engaged in Thomas' cultural criticism, there's no going back. It's nearly impossible to listen to lines like being strong was only good if you were also really useful, and he had to be really useful, without hearing something sinister. Cast off your shackles and rise up, little engines. Down with Topham Hatt. Sodor revolution now." William Hughes in 2017 wrote his own article for AV Club titled, "Read This, Thomas the Tank Engine is a fucked up authoritarian nightmare," where he lambasts the show for one of its more infamous episodes, The Sad Story of Henry, and ends the article by saying, quote, "But don't worry folks, Henry was eventually okay. A later segment sees him, shorn of all that pesky free will, emerge from the tunnel and get back to work, stepping in after one of his friends is induced to work himself so hard he sustains a debilitating injury. Happy endings all around." Democrat Dad in 2007 made an article titled Thomas the Tank Engine, Anti-Semitism, and the Sex Pistols, where the author viewed the idea of engines being, quote, "really useful" as having anti-Semitic undertones. Quote, "Anti-Semitism has always used the language of usefulness. Regulated to minority status, and in most cases restricted from owning property, Jews throughout Europe developed roles outside of the traditional agrarian ones. They charge interest, gasp, for money lending, and their religion's reliance on the world of the Talmud led many Jews to find work in journalism, academic pursuits, literature, and the arts. It would all seem perfectly natural in the world of Sir Topham Hatt. Around the end of their analysis, they also said, quote, "I don't mean to say that Sir Topham Hatt is a closet Nazi. I don't mean even to say that the Thomas the Tank Engine series is overtly anti-Semitic, or that W.V. Awdry was a Nazi sympathizer while writing children's stories for his son during the aerial bombardment of his country by the Nazis. But the parallels are there. The conformist outlook on the series does match that of regimes throughout history, which favors social control and work to restrict or even criminalize individualism." Is to break character for just a split second. Oh, God, I love it when journalists are just fucking scum. I do really love it when journalists want to accuse you of being racist, but because you have no evidence of actually being racist, they have to insinuate and say, "Oh, I don't mean to say that you're racist, but the parallels are there. Someone can make a fucking... God, go fuck yourself." Anyways, back in character. Thomas Tomska Ridgewell, in his video titled "Thomas the Tank Engine is Darker Than You Think," has a whole chapter dedicated to the world's famous, really useful title that the engines wish to achieve, and has this to say.
In the books, the term really useful is capitalized. It is a designation, an almost cult-like branding. Because the truth is, this isn't exactly a hot take, but the trains are kinda slaves. But basically what really useful means in this universe is that you have value, that you are of worth to this ecosystem, and you can be used. You are of use. And trains are constantly having to prove that they are useful, to fight for it. They are constantly talking about and worrying that they are not really useful anymore. Sounds like pretty regular capitalism, to be honest. Speaking of Sodor, when I made my video on Thomas and Friends earlier this year, the mere suggestion that the engines were anything less than free and willing participants in their own labor efforts was met with a pretty intense outrage, and I got dangerously close to making a whole second video all about the definition of slavery. And since I'm here, not to get all baby's first video essay, but a slave is defined as someone forbidden to quit their service for an enslaver, and who is treated by the enslaver as their property. Slavery typically involves the enslaved person being made to perform some form of work while also having their location or residence dictated by the enslaver. Similarly, forced labor is when an individual is forced to work against their own will under the threat of violence or another punishment, and their ability to work productively is under the complete control of another person.
Sorry, it's just that Dunning-Kruger smugness. It's fucking overpowering.
Even The Guardian had a thing to say about Thomas, where in the article "Thomas the Tank Engine had to shut the hell up to save children everywhere," written by Tracy Van Slyke, she writes about the dark and sinister nature of Thomas, by writing, quote, "Thomas and those friends are trains that toil away endlessly on the Isle of Sodor, which seems to be forever caught in British colonial times. And on the surface, the show seems to impart good moral lessons about hard work and friendship, but if you look through the steam rising up from the coal-powered train stacks, you realize that the pretty puffs of smoke are concealing some pretty twisted, anachronistic messages. For one, these trains perform tasks dictated by their imperious little white boss, Sir Topham Hatt, also known as the Fat Controller, whose attire of a top hat, tuxedo, and big round belly is just a little too obvious. Basically, he's the monopoly dictator of their funky little island. Hatt orders the engines to do everything from hauling freight to carrying passengers to running whatever random errand he wants done whenever he wants it done, regardless of their pre-existing schedules. In general, these people view the engines working hard to keep the steam engine spirit alive as having a dark underbelly that contains a twisted reality of control that is paraded around by the Fat Controller, where the engines are treated like slaves with no real sense of free will or individualism, with no support towards initiative. They argue that the engines are in constant competition with one another, tearing each other down so that they can be crowned very useful by their master, an environment that breeds resentment and jealousy within their ranks. These arguments, ones that are quite popular on the anti-Thomas side of this conversation, are not only incredibly harsh and shows a lot of venom for this show, but only work if you completely ignore how well the engines are treated by the Fat Controller, how a railway workforce functions, and the core point of the island of Sodor. So from all the articles and the few videos that I've watched about people hating this show, here are the main arguments that people make. Number 1. Thomas and friends fight each other for the Fat Controller's approval. 2. The island of Sodor is abusive imperialist hierarchy to the extreme. 3. The punishments that the engines receive are unnecessary and very cruel. And 4. The really useful engine title is capitalist propaganda and is a sneaky way for the engines to not revolt. There's also an argument that people make about the show and books being sexist, to which I'll just simply say, if you thought that a man born in the early 1900s and was very rooted in traditional upbringing was going to produce super progressive stories, then I do not know what to tell you. I mean, there's also the point that Mavis and Daisy are also engines on Sodor, so that argument isn't valid. So firstly, let's tackle the engines biting at each other's throats for dominance first, because that is probably the easiest to debunk. Rogue words this criticism best in her article, where she states, quote, "The trains, complicit in maintaining this unjust system, humiliate each other for the small scraps of praise the little tyrant doles out, rather than banding together. No unions on Sodor. Thomas and Percy are supposedly best friends, but they bicker constantly over those special jobs. These rivalries are punctuated by nasty banter, which fuels the larger system of cruelty. Whenever trains express interest in traveling or doing another job or flying like Harold the helicopter, they are mocked and derided until they stop dreaming and accept their station. Engines who threaten efficiency with burdensome personalities are banished from Sodor. When new and foreign trains arrive on the island, they are subject to jealousy and derision, as the Sodor engines are continuously made to fear obsolescence." This accusation is not only one that was done in bad faith, but it has a core misunderstanding of workplace culture. While they do indulge in light-hearted teasing, the engines on Sodor do not share great venom with each other. Their teasing is more akin to a group of people who have their own in-jokes and do it to help humble their fellow workers and newcomers. Teasing at work happens all the time. And the foreign engines that are subject to, quote, jealousy and derision, most of the time they are shown to be wrong and they welcome in this new foreign engine. Just saying. That or the teasing is simply a representation of kids messing around with each other. Because as we all know, kids are very capable of a ruthless insult.
"I'm going to the scrapyard today," Edward called to Thomas. "What? Already? You're not that old." "I am a splendid engine," answered James. "Ready for anything. You never see my paint dirty." "Oh," said Toby innocently, "that's why you once needed bootlaces, to be ready, I suppose." "Phew," remarked Thomas. "What a funny smell. Annie, Clarabelle, do you know what I think it is? It's ditch water."
I'm Great Western, and I... Quack, quack, quack. What? Ye heard? Quack, quack you go. Sounds like you'd an egg laid. Now wheesht and let an engine sleep.
"I heard tell about an engine and some tar wagons." "Shut up," said James. "It's not funny." Well, surely, James, it wasn't a you."
The humor being more sarcastic, mean, and scathing, something that loads of people criticize the show for, is merely the style of British comedy. Sarcasm is their native tongue, so it would of course stand to reason that a series written by a man who grew up during the 40s would be a lot drier with its humor than today's more progressive standards. In episodes where engines start getting too big for their buffers, the engine in question will get what's coming to them. Some teasing from his fellow workers will ensue, and then stop once they prove themselves to have been humbled from their mistakes. In short, the engines are not out to get each other. They are simply enjoying the workflow and making fun of the engines who talk too big and think they're better than everyone else. It's not fighting for a scrap of power situation on Sodor like these people claim. Now we have the second argument, the imperialist accusation. To quote Roke, "Within the engine ranks, the trains enforce clear hierarchies and mirror the class rigidity of their aristocratic masters." Now these people are correct in saying that Thomas and friends work under a hierarchy. The engines follow the orders of the Fat Controller, and if they do not fulfill their duties, they are scolded at and sometimes punished more severely depending on what they had done. The phrase "really useful engines don't argue" is said a couple of times in the later seasons of the show. This, according to anti-Thomas people, is all done to paint Sodor as a sweet little nightmare that loses its charm the moment you look slightly underneath. Thomas is just an imperialist hierarchy that takes advantage of the fact that steamies are dying out so that they will work themselves to the bone without question under the threat of death. Sir Topham Hatt is only doing this as a power trip to get the engines to do what he wants without receiving pushback. And there are a couple of reasons why this argument does not work for the island of Sodor. For one, the Fat Controller, if he was a dictator, is an incredibly bad one. He is a character who gives the engines lots of chances before he finally puts his foot down. There are even some occasions where his orders and decisions turn out to be wrong, and he even apologizes for the mistakes he has made.
I had decided to send Douglas back and keep you.
I'm sorry, sir,
said Donald. I should think so too. You have upset my arrangements. I want to be fair, Douglas, but I don't know. I really don't know. It's Donald and Douglas, sir. They say, sir, that if you send them away, sir, they'll be turned into scrap, sir. That would be dreadful, sir. Please, sir, don't send them away. Thank you, Percy. That will do. Donald and Douglas, I hear that your work in the snow was good. You shall have a new coat of paint.
Thank you, sir. Does this mean that the both of us...
The Fat Controller smiled. It means... But the rest of his speech was drowned in a delighted chorus of cheers and whistles.
Thomas and Percy, this new crane has an important job to do. I have heard that you have not been helping him today. You will go to your sheds and consider how you will improve yourselves tomorrow.
Tell them I'm sorry I was rude to them.
So it was you, murmured the Fat Controller. I owe those engines an apology.
Sir!
Not now, Percy. He's at the farm on Toby's line.
But those tracks are wobbly, cried Percy.
They are safe enough.
Percy saved the day,
said Thomas. I'm sorry, Percy, said the Fat Controller. We must do a better job of listening to you in future.
The Fat Controller acts more like a father figure, someone who is kind to the engines but knows when to be stern and blunt if it means that the engines will realize what they've done has impacted the island. This is not a case of an abuse in power, but more akin to a firm slap on the wrist so that the engines know that they must do their job to keep Sodor alive. And finally, the reason for this imperialist hierarchy is simply down to the fact that Sodor is an island that just needs it. Sodor is a railway. These things require a top-down system so that everything can run properly. Sodor doesn't have to progress, because progress, in case you didn't pick it up already, was what killed the steam era. This hierarchy that Sodor implements is not only efficient, but it also pays tribute to the past. And in wanting to conserve that past, this hierarchy needs to be implemented, and it's not inherently a bad thing. When keeping a tradition, hierarchy is needed. Someone on top has to look over the inhabitants working within the system, and if things go astray, these leaders have to put a stop to the trouble and make sure that the individual realizes their place in the world of the system. Engines cannot go around and give orders to other engines, form unions, or revolt. Not only would this be a waste of time because they already get everything they possibly need, but to do so would be to throw everything into disorder, and the efforts it would take to clean up their mess would be far too great. Dr. Eric Sigman, a psychologist who researched children's television, makes a very good argument in support of Sodor's structure. To quote him, "If you are looking at the world of mechanistic things, the military, the police, the fire service, those things have hierarchy. People have uniforms and they have to know their place. Things that involve men and machinery normally have some sort of hierarchy and social order. The engines are not being oppressed in having to work, but they are there to fulfill a place that's needed in the workforce. With these engines working to keep the image of a system that society has thought to be old-fashioned and outdated alive and well, it gives the island hope that it can prove to outsiders that Sodor is an actually good system, and not just a, quote, minister nostalgic for the power and the glory of the British Empire, like some people have claimed." Though I think asking a man who was raised during a time where Britain was a global superpower to tone down his national pride is asking a bit too much. As for the engines being slaves, probably one of the biggest accusations that anti-Thomas people love to parrot is also just plainly not true. For one simple reason. Engines are not people. You have to keep in mind that despite them having humanistic features, the engines on Sodor are still just machines. Machines that are made solely to do jobs like the ones on Sodor. To derive a machine of its purpose is to waste valuable resources in keeping them around. You wouldn't get yourself a car with the intention of never driving it, would you? This same logic applies to the engines. What is the point of keeping an engine alive and running if it's not going to do anything? Why not just slap them in a museum? That's basically the same thing. To make sure this doesn't happen, the Fat Controller makes sure that the engines are seen by passengers to be hard-working and are very good at their respective jobs. If they don't, punishment isn't far behind. Which is a great segue towards tackling the third argument of Thomas and Friends' punishments and why lots of them are so severe. If an engine was to try and get out of work, cause mischief, or just be a general nuisance, it would affect everything else on Sodor. In the world of Thomas, numerous engines had their moments of defiance, and because of that, Sodor suffered greatly. This is not the same as a person going on strike in a big business where one person can easily be replaced. These engines are needed to get work done. Losing an engine would be like losing 500 workers. There is no benefit to defying on this island, and the Fat Controller does occasionally have to remind the engines on how important they are to the island of Sodor by showing them what the consequences to their actions will be. This is where the arguments I make will temporarily go from stuff you can find in the show to just general commentary on how parenting has evolved since the 1900s. For those that do not know, Audrey was raised as an Anglican Catholic. He was so devoted to his faith that he trained to become a clergyman, hence why his full title is actually Wilbert Reverend Audrey. If you want evidence to how deep this faith went, Audrey wrote an entire non-fiction book titled Our Child Begins to Pray, a guide for parents, where his introduction reads, quote, "Dear parents, you are asking how can we teach our baby to pray? We hope this little book will help you. It is part of what my wife and I have learned in 10 years of parenthood. There is much more that we do not yet know, but we are still learning. Taught by our children." So, yeah, to say that he was a man of faith is quite the understatement. And because he was a very devout Catholic, it makes complete sense that his works are filled with themes of natural order, obedience to a higher being, and consequences for ego and pride, all done in a child-friendly manner. The 1900s was also a time where lessons to children were taught in a far different way than they are now. In the olden days, tales were much simpler, and the consequences to bad or evil actions were much harsher and way more threatening. This was done as a way to scare children into behaving themselves, something that Thomas has all over the books and the show. From the engines getting punished, the children who read or watch them would also get that urge to do good and stay on the right path, trusting their authorities and fearing bad consequences for naughty behavior. These stories are to highlight what can happen to a society if someone decides to defy the hierarchy and attempt to deconstruct or maliciously destroy it. To quote Christopher Audrey, children are disciplined in a rather different way today than they were in 1945. This is a golden case of old-style parenting working its magic, and modern times has just moved on from such traditions. Scaring kids in fiction was something that was very popular back in the day, and isn't necessarily a bad thing. Scaring kids is a good way for them to learn things quickly, and through fiction is that fear expressed in a safe environment, where they learn to appreciate the comfort of natural order and respecting authorities. Dr. Eric Sigman understood this perfectly. To quote him, "People say children are different these days, we've moved on, but that is a very arrogant position. It's a popular position and media friendly, but actually it's not children who have moved on, it's adults. Children's needs have not changed. It's a very convenient way to explain away the growing gap between what parents are able to do and what parents feel comfortable to do versus what children need during their early years. I see a lot of young children, and they like rules and boundaries. Not to be treated in an authoritarian way, not at all, but children feel comfortable when there are boundaries and there is a construct. It makes them feel relaxed, and it's very important for child development. Someone who also understood this want in children is Charles C.W. Cook, who in his National Review article titled In Defense of Thomas the Tank Engine, he says in response to criticism of the Fat Controller, Hat's arbitration served to strike a keen balance between the values of duty and disobedience, both of which are vital ideas for any child to internalize. This is not adult literature, and nor is it a lecture at Berkeley. It is a series of stories aimed at young children who need to rebel and to play, but who also need, indeed who crave, rules. Hat is not capricious or mean or violent. He doesn't cheat or steal or abuse his engines. He's just in charge of the railway, as parents are in charge of their kids. If there is any lesson to be taken from his personality, it is that those in a position of responsibility can often be inadvertently amusing. Even Christopher Audrey recognized this, saying in an interview, quote, "Children need rules and authority. They like the idea of a world in which there is order and certain behavior is expected." This attitude and desire of parents to help their kids understand hierarchies and leaders is something that transitions them from rebellious spirits to good, hard-working members of society when they get into the workforce, which has the same general attitude. Companies work best when everyone is on the same page, knows their place in the system, and work hard to make sure that the quality of their output is up to par. These systems have no time for people who try and change the rules so that they can be more merciful or reasonable. The system is fine. It's the engine's job to make sure that they respect the hierarchy, or else Sodor is fucked. I do have a small video where I talk more in depth towards two of the more infamous examples of Thomas and Friends, but in case you don't want to watch it, my main point was that Henry and Smudger got what they deserved. Those who claim that the engines of Sodor should revolt against their system and tear up the traditions of the island fundamentally misunderstand the very reason why Sodor exists in the first place. Sodor is the last line of defense preventing steam engine kind from going extinct, the last ember of an era of railways that has been ravaged and lost to time all over the rest of the world. If the engines were to revolt against this system and self-govern themselves, they would be proving to the entire world why they went out of fashion to begin with. Why would steam engines form unions and overthrow the man who was trying to show that they are worth keeping around? Do you think that it's wise to go into a society that is trying to keep their traditions alive and then not participate in said society over an abhorrence to put in the work? What does that kind of behavior show to the rest of the world? The island of Sodor needs the engines to keep it running, and to keep the dream of steam engine railways alive. To destroy it would be a very foolish decision. To abandon their rules, bring in more different engines from across the world, and go to war with the Fat Controller would show that the age of steam engines and their usefulness has truly died out, and for good reason. Is it wrong to demand that engines work within the rules of Sodor? Is it dark to punish those who step out of line despite multiple warnings? Is it wrong to demand that newcomers respect and honor the traditions that kept a society going for the longest time without many hiccups? And is it wrong to reward good behavior? Which brings me to tackling the last argument, the critics' concern with the phrase, really useful engine.
But basically what really useful means in this universe is that you have value, that you are of worth to this ecosystem, and you can be used. You are of use. And trains are constantly having to prove that they are useful, to fight for it. They are constantly talking about and worrying that they are not really useful anymore. Sounds like pretty regular capitalism, to be honest.
Revisiting the show, however, reveals a dark totalitarian hellscape where you'd be better off dead than be one of the many indentured trains on the island of Sodor. This twisted authoritarian nightmare is not just confined to this episode. Sodor was designed like this from the ground up, dating back to the original books. If you're interested in a deep dive, Jaya Tolentino from The New Yorker has done a fantastic job of breaking down the overt fascist themes in the show's so-called lessons.
Okay, sorry to break character again and ruining the pacing of my video, but I just want to get this off my chest. So many critics of Thomas from the articles I could find nearly always reference this one as being a golden source for their findings. So of course when I was given this a read, I was expecting to be hit with lots of factual, undeniable claims that could make me rethink my entire position surrounding the show. But when I finally gave this article a read, it's now clear to me why the criticism surrounding this show is so bad. Not only does Gia Tolentino leave out the fact that Henry was let out literally an episode later, which was her main argument for her article, but she also uses YouTube comments to conclude her argument, admits to using wiki sites, critical assessments, and message board threads for her research and not just watching the show, talks about Smudger's fate without telling you why he got that punishment, mentions Bulgy's anti-rail ideas and tells you his fate without elaborating on anything. She just for some reason expected you to side with the bus who literally has this shit on the side of his frame, gets the fate of Scruffy wrong, and that's just me being autistic, and says that the trucks get, quote, disciplined into fearful obedience through public symbolic punishments, when that's just not even true, claims that Diesel only, quote, struggles to prove that he's as useful as the steam engines and is not just a certified revolution-hungry piece of shit, claims that Thomas's coaches, Annie and Clarabelle, were given to him as prizes, and references an article from 2009, which is an amalgamation of everything I've been responding to for the past 20 minutes and more, tells us the lore of the engines getting scrapped overseas by referencing a fucking Tumblr thread, and uses another user's wild conspiracy of, quote, maybe that's just what railway management wants the engines to think as a legitimate talking point, and talks about how one of the Thomas voice actors in later seasons quit due to low pay, and calls for the trains to have an overdue, similar revolution. So many people have used this article. Fuck me. Anyways, back to the video. Key to the pick yourself up by your bootstraps mythos in the United States is the notion that anyone can rise to the top with hard work and initiative. Otherwise, you face the very real possibility that your toddler raised in an environment full of labor abuses and pro-toting propaganda might one day look at you and earnestly promise to be very useful, the show's highest compliment for an engine. In our home, Thomas and friends must rule Britannia no more, and some ugly truths about unjust train society must be told. Inevitably, the trains get in a fight and pick on one another or generally mess up whatever job they are supposed to be doing until Hat has to scold one of them into being a really useful engine, because their sole utility in life is their ability to satisfy his whims. Yeah, because I want to teach my kid to admire a controlling autocrat. Where the fuck am I? I just think it's quite funny that this simple phrase brings out such venom in some people. Now yes, there is a discussion to be had about societies that exploit their workers under the guise of them contributing to a higher cause and not actually receiving their due payments. Many societies across the world have come up with many interesting and sinister ways to keep workers in line where they work in horrible conditions and have little pay. Those conversations are interesting and are conversations that do not apply to Sodor. Not only are the engines, like I said before, treated very fucking well, but to actively try and villainize the idea of being really useful, and you try to paint it as something cult-like, is extremely dishonest. They always point to the fact that Sodor works on a basis that if an engine is no longer really useful, they will be scrapped. And while yes, that is a very dark implication towards an engine's fate, can you name me an example of the Fat Controller actually going through with this threat? Because in the books and the show, there isn't any. And no, Oliver doesn't count, Fatty didn't do that. It's almost just like a quick little shock so that the engines will go back to being useful, much like the threat of being homeless in the real world should a child become lazy. And above all else, what is wrong in wanting to be useful? There's nothing wrong with wanting to prove your worth to a workforce, especially if your work is actively keeping a tradition alive and thriving. People generally feel good when they can provide a service towards their country, and the engines are the exact same. To villainize hard work, demonize the idea of going above and beyond, hating the idea of hard work being rewarded with benefits, and to revel in ideas of revolution with no end goal in mind, is exactly why the show and books worked for so many children. Thomas is a children's story that teaches kids fundamentally good lessons. Children's literature is not where you expose the deep political messiness of the true nature of the workplace and ideas like unions or revolution. Those ideas are reserved for the rebellious teens and young adult years, where your mind is able to understand nuance. Children's stories, especially olden ones, were made to not only explore the vast imagination of a child, but to motivate them to do better for not just themselves, but their families and fellow countrymen, to be a good member to society, a value that is deeply rooted in tradition. And I'm sorry to say, in response to those modern critics who value individualism above literally everything else, but sometimes conforming to society's expectations is a good thing to teach kids. Not every child has to change the world. Sometimes conforming is the right thing to do. Who knows? Maybe if you actually sat down and watched the show or read the books again, you could learn some pretty nice lessons, and maybe you can see the true value in being really useful. Thomas and Friends is a series that teaches kids many things. Work hard, behave, respect your authorities, don't mess around, go above and beyond, don't discriminate those who are trying to integrate, and strive to give back to the country that raised you. All of these lessons are valuable and integral for a child to grow up with a good head on their shoulders and have a good moral compass. Which is exactly why it baffles me that such easy lessons to learn are twisted and warped into such insane claims by critics who claim to be holier than thou, painting the show and books as something they just aren't. If Sodor is your idea of an imperialist nightmare, then I'm afraid you have never seen or experienced true hardship or exploitation. Lord knows I feel like a system like Sodor would be a welcome change of pace if it meant that housing, healthcare, water, and food were free and guaranteed if you just put in some work. Would anyone be against this? I don't know, that sounds like a good fucking deal to me. The research for this video, while it has been very entertaining and insightful, has definitely exposed to me the kind of people that actively hate Thomas. The critics of Thomas are mainly people that value themselves over anybody else, refusing to subscribe to the idea that giving back to the society that raised you is a decent thing to do. Everything must be progressive and anything traditional should be destroyed, a mindset that is as idealistic as it is childish. Teaching kids that tradition is important, should be respected, and that there will be consequence to their bad actions are lessons that are oppressive and conformist. So instead they should revolt and overthrow the system and revolutionize the world into some other society that allows children to explore who they are uninterrupted and unbothered. Societal responsibilities be damned. This mindset is a tempting and idealistic dream that very quickly becomes sinister once the pillars of old have been destroyed, only to be replaced with misdirection and lack of guidance. They believe that hard work is exploitative, something that is the only demand the world expects of you, ignoring the fundamental goodness hard work brings and all the other factors that make a tradition sacred and beloved. Thomas and Friends, to put it simply, exposes those who respect the past and those who don't. It's a world that serves as a time capsule, showing a world that, while idealistic, is wholesome in its portrayal of good, while also containing that comically dark edge that old God-fearing stories were known for, inspiring many people who read or watch it to be better. It takes a very certain kind of joyless cynicism to experience the stories and read up on Audrey's life and not feel a sense of comfort and love. From its call to tradition, respect for children's imagination, and helping to preserve a history that society deemed to be obsolete, Audrey created a world that is truly wonderful, And I'm done with cynical critics writing article after article talking about a series they either misunderstand or barely watched. Anybody who has truly experienced the stories for themselves know what the stories are trying to say. And I think that more videos that go in that kind of direction for Thomas Discourse, videos that show the true wonderful nature of this world, would be a very welcome change of pace. My name is Manga Writer, and to end off this video, I will give you one last quote about the legacy of Thomas. One more quote by Audrey himself. In my study at home, I have a very thick file which I prize highly. It is full of letters. They are from children, mothers, fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, aunts, and uncles who have written to me over the years to say how much they and their children enjoy the books. I prize these highly, of course, but there are some I value even more. There are letters from fathers or grandfathers who are or have been professional railwaymen, saying that they too like the books. That is praise indeed. God bless you, Audrey.